Sorry for the delay.
Introduction.
I made the introduction already, so we are ready to go.
Okay,
Yes, go on.
Jump straight in. Why not? Okay, well, pleased to be with you all, and that we've made this work. Straight into my slides here. Please let me know. I'm just waiting to load up, but just let me know if they if it works for you. I'm just waiting. Can you see my slides here?
Yes, we do, but you have to go to presentation mode.
Yes. That's what I had done. Have they not? They're not showing.
Do you have two monitors?
That
is the problem.
Right.
All right, here we go.
This is working? Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay, right. So this will be a talk on brain mechanisms of classic psychedelic drugs such as psilocybin, LSD, and all these interesting compounds. And so I begin at the molecular level, addressing the basic pharmacology of psychedelics, and there the major point to emphasize is that these serotonergic classic psychedelics all appear to have appreciable agonist signaling properties at a certain serotonin receptor subtype, the serotonin 2A receptor. And we have PET imaging data to look at in human brain, labeling functionally available serotonin 2A receptors, work done in the last 5 years, published in the last 5 years. And so these are the best images that we have to date, to my knowledge, of the regional distribution of the serotonin 2A receptor. You can see that they are heavily expressed in the cortex, and especially so in transmodal cortex. I'm not sure if someone wants to mute their mic there. I'm just getting a little bit of audio coming back. And so we know from the mid 1980s that there is a strong positive correlation between the affinity of serotonin 2A receptor agonist psychedelic drugs, the affinity for the serotonin 2A receptor, and these drugs' potency. Yes, I'm not sure if someone has their mic on and whether you want to just mute it. I'll carry on regardless. Okay, I'm not sure if we should quite a bit of background noise. That phone's going off and doors closing. If that can't be muted, I'll do my best. Little distraction.
We mute everybody, so you should be okay.
Oh, okay. That's strange.
I don't know.
Okay, I'll do my best. Okay, so the serotonin 2A receptor, we know that there's this strong positive correlation between the affinity for the 2A receptor and these drugs' potency. And we also know that if you pre-treat with a serotonin 2A receptor antagonist or blocker, and then give a psychedelic, whether it's psilocybin or LSD, or now we know ayahuasca as well, containing the 2A agonist DMT, then you'll effectively abolish the characteristic behavioral effects of the psychedelic. So 2A receptor is critically important to the action of these compounds. The next question to address really is what does the 2A receptor do? What does signaling initiate? And there the general principle to emphasize is that a variety of different forms of functional and anatomical plasticity. We can look at anatomical markers of neuroplasticity and see that they are markedly increased with exposure to 2A agonist psychedelics, particularly in the cortex. A doubling of BDNF was a finding in the late 90s. And now more recently, we have this clear evidence of increases in synaptogenesis with a variety of serotonin 2A receptor agonist psychedelics. Perhaps the most recent exciting addition to this work is in embryonic brains of different species, where it has been found that 2A signaling increases the proliferation of basal progenitor cells, so neural stem cells, pre-neurons if you want. And this process is required for the cortical expansion that in a sense defines our species. The sheer number of neurons that we have in our cortex, particularly to body mass, is what sets us apart in terms of our brains, and that the early phase, the embryonic phase of that cortical expansion, a required phase, is encoded by serotonin 2A receptor signaling. That was a finding Jing et al. In Neuron last year. So we have these interesting anatomical markers of plasticity, but we can also look at functional markers. We can look at learning, increases in learning rate with exposure to LSD. This is low-level learning, aversive learning, classical conditioning, air puffs, and this work is in rabbits. So accelerating the learning rate with LSD and then slowing it down with a 2A blocker. And we can look at learning itself, learning new things, but we can also look at unlearning old things, something that is also a component of plasticity, unlearning, and perhaps the kind of effect that you might want if you're looking to treat psychopathology. So evidence for increases in extinction learning with exposure to psychedelics as well. We can look at cognitive and psychological flexibility and increases in those behaviors and phenomena as well in humans. So the next logical question, I think, is in a sense to put psychedelics to one side and ask, so why do we have this system, this plasticity system? When does it engage? Under what natural conditions? Okay, there's a link with the expansion of the brain itself, the cortex, but under what conditions within an animal's lifetime will you engage this plasticity system? And there, I suppose, in a sense, like evolutionary pressures, adaptive pressures seem to engage this system. So chronic stress is linked with an upregulation of the receptors themselves. A variety of different stressors appear to do that here, looking just one example with hypoxia. And we can also look at readout of signaling at the 2A receptor given different backgrounds of stress. So we can look at chronic stress and then read out with the administration of the 2A agonist, looking at a behavioral readout of the action of that compound, head shakes. This is the marker that we have in animals of a animal, non-human animal on a psychedelic, is their head shakes, wet dog shakes, and a marked increase there with a background of chronic stress. So the principle is that chronic stress is priming this 2A system, making it more sensitive. And just another finding here, looking at expression of a plasticity gene, an early gene, with a background of maternal separation and chronic immobilization stress. Then the psychedelics given, in this case DOI, and you get this massive increase in the readouts of signaling at that receptor. So if these are examples of a primed system in conditions of chronic stress, and that seems to be somewhat specific, as in the chronicity of the stress, how would you release the natural ligand itself, the natural agonist, which of course is serotonin? Well, punishment paradigms appear to do that very reliably, and a range of different stressors, acute stressors, tail pinch, handling, swim stress, are all releasing serotonin onto this primed system. So that appears to be, in a sense, why we have this system and how it can engage under adverse conditions. And so recently I introduced this notion of pivotal mental states, which describes transient hyperplastic states in which there is an markedly increased potential to undergo some kind of psychological transformation. And these are states that, because of the plasticity in which they occur, a defining property of the states, they're exceptionally sensitive to contextual conditions. If those conditions are favorable, or you might say enriched, like a therapeutic container, and this plasticity system and this state engages and occurs, then one may pivot towards improved mental health. But on the other hand, if such states were to occur under stressful, adverse conditions, perhaps the usual conditions in which this plasticity system engages naturally under adversity, then the more likely scenario is a pivot towards pathology. So in a sense, these hyperplastic states are outcome agnostic, and I think that's a useful framework for thinking about psychedelic therapy. And if we look at the recent trials that have been published and studies that have been published in the last 15 years or so, you'll notice that all of them have manipulated the context in what you might call an enriched way. I'm not sure what just came in. It was fine until then, but let's keep going. So this positive context is there in all of these studies. Music listening is across the board very consistent in all of these studies, and you can look again at these studies and see that the improvements in mental health outcomes are rapid. They also appear to be enduring even after just 1 or 2 administrations. And the other thing is that there's a range of different symptom clusters that are being looked at here with positive findings suggestive of some kind of transdiagnostic action. So then the logical next question there is, what is that common space? What is psychedelic therapy targeting that overlaps between different diagnostic categories or symptom clusters? And there I propose it's maladaptive habits of mind and or behavior, whether it's the negative cognitive bias in depression or certain entrenched ways, biased ways of looking at oneself and the world or behaving. And so the solution, I know it's simplistic, it's a model, is that such entrenched maladaptive habits of mind and or behavior would require some active relaxation in order for them to be remediated or revised in a healthier way. And that's what I'm proposing psychedelic therapy does. So here is a image popularized by a few people, Michael Pollan being one, which shows the communication profile across different regions in the brain, labeled on the periphery or colored on the periphery, these circles, and then the colors are representative of communities of regions that have a high degree of functional coupling within a given community under baseline conditions. On the left, placebo, and then on the right, psilocybin. And it's very clear to see that the community communication increases markedly under psilocybin. And that's something that we've seen now quite reliably across different psychedelics with LSD, albeit using, in this particular example, a different approach, seeding the primary visual cortex, identified with retinotopic mapping, and then seeing this massive increase in cortical coupling to V1 under LSD, eyes closed scanning conditions. This effect correlated with participants' ratings of the intensity of their complex imagery with eyes closed, the vividness of their complex imagery. Similar kind of results using functional connectivity density, or looking at global connectivity, so the hot regions becoming more significantly coupled to other regions in the whole of the brain. Perhaps the more intuitive way to look at that result is to look at the dynamics. And so here, these 8 arrays, these patterns at the top, can be thought of as states, attractor states, if you understand what's meant by that the brain can gravitate into at any given time. And so we're looking at the proportion of these states across a scanning period. In this study, I think that was 8, no, maybe it was longer. I think it was more like 15 minutes, eyes closed rest with DMT. And the main finding, and this is replicated across psychedelics, is that the brain gravitates into this. It's slightly counterintuitive with no coloration here, but this is a globally coherent brain state. So imagine the fluctuating spontaneous activity being phase locked in the different regions here. So globally coherent, much more prevalent under the psychedelic. Also similar rule, albeit attenuated, with the limbic network. But what are those networks that are skipped over, if you want, or diminished in their prominence? And there, the rule is that these are high-level frontoparietal networks, whether it's the default mode network or these other executive networks. They are markedly diminished under DMT, and this is a consistent finding. So while we might look at the functional connectivity density and somehow think that this module or pattern engages more, it's actually counterintuitive. It's the opposite. It's that this pattern melds more into the rest of the brain, becomes less distinct, less segregated from the rest of the brain, and the brain itself becomes more globally coherent in its activity. So there's a kind of demodulation or desegregation or increase in global functional connectivity in the brain under psychedelics. So this, I think, these findings move us along a little bit from a somewhat outdated story around disintegration within the default mode network correlating with ego dissolution under psychedelics. I would say these days it's more a focus on a diminishment of the visiting of frontoparietal networks more generally. And as you can see here, these networks, here's DMT, the functional connectivity density result. These networks, or this pattern, is a pattern where the 2A receptor is most densely expressed. And we've got a lot of brains on this slide because, yeah, maybe this is attribution bias, but I don't think so. I mean, we're looking at this formally. This pattern crops up in a lot of, interesting properties of functional and anatomical brain organization. Whether we look at the regions that have expanded most in our species, the transmodal cortex, and we plotted this one in collaboration with Andrea Lupi at Cambridge, yeah, a significant relationship, as you would intuit, just eyeballing the spatial maps. We can look at the principal gradients in the functional connectivity in the brain and see the transmodal regions being, again, those regions where 2A receptors are most densely expressed, we can look at longer fiber lengths within this pattern. At this stage, I'll call it the human pattern or the human system. We can look at between subject variability being higher in this plastic, lightly myelinated human system. We can look at faster metabolism, aerobic glycolysis. We can look at not just expansion evolutionarily, but developmentally from infanthood to adulthood. Again, a similar profile. The action of psychedelics, as I've already highlighted, processing of longer temporal windows and more abstract information. So this is a high-level system that houses the 2A receptors that psychedelics work on, and that this system is dysregulated, broken down under a psychedelic. And this provides a useful background for a model that I introduced with Carl Friston a couple of years ago now, I think, that I call Rebus for relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. Phonetically, it works, and I think people remember it. Remember the acronym, and it very much takes inspiration from hierarchical predictive processing, popularized by the likes of Carl Friston, albeit with his free energy spin on things. And I suppose at the base of hierarchical predictive processing is the Bayesian brain idea, the idea that the brain is a model of the world that it inhabits, and that model develops and finesses over time through learning, and also, of course, evolutionarily through lifetimes. But the idea is it is becomes a model of the environment that it inhabits, and that model, in a sense, allows us to function more efficiently, so that we don't necessarily have to process every detail of the world, but can take shortcuts, can read text like this because of our internal modeling. We can look at static images like this, and you might hallucinate motion, because that's your brain, in a sense, working optimally, you could say, in that if you see something like this in the world ordinarily, there would be motion, so you're in a sense primed for that, and that internal model kicks in, and then you perceive through that model, and that's why some of you are probably hallucinating some motion here that doesn't actually exist. And so that's the basic principle, and then the quest becomes, how do we test it? And so to test it, we need to be a little bit more concrete about how such encoding, how such hierarchical organization is instantiated in brain activity. And recently it's emerged that cortical traveling waves might be one of potentially many candidates for how this processing is instantiated in the brain. And there, the rule is that when one has one's eyes closed, the direction of cortical traveling waves is in a top-down direction. Here, a very simple model or approach, which is front to back, frontal cortex to occipital cortex. So with eyes closed, it's front to back, it's top down. Now with eyes open, with the photic information coming in, that direction flips and it becomes bottom up. Why? Because now there's stuff to process. And this has been shown empirically and modeled and linked quite compellingly to hierarchical predictive coding or processing. So with this understood, it felt very tantalizing, and I reached out to the authors behind this particular work with a proposal that we share some of our intravenous DMT data with the strong hypothesis that we would see a flipping in the direction of the traveling waves, consistent with what you see when you go from eyes closed to eyes open. And that's what we saw. We saw it very, very clearly here with DMT, just as with visual stimulation. The drug goes in and there's a flip towards a bottom-up flow of the cortical traveling waves. And this effect mapped very neatly onto the subjective ratings collected minute by minute. Yeah, so very clear support for the prior hypothesis. So that's one example of some support for the idea, the principle. And just to expand on the principle a little bit, you can look at the phenomenology of phenomenon like ego dissolution. If the ego, the sense of self, is a model, a particularly high level, central, you might say, internal model, then the dissolution that is described of that sense of self, that ego, under psychedelics fits the model very well. And as one thing diminishes, is there a disinhibition or a release of material that was previously being held down or suppressed by the hierarchically supraordinate system. And there you can look at things like the visual imagery, the dream-like imagery that percolates up, and also the strong emotions that are released under psychedelics, these strong emotional catharses that are very common, people crying and reporting things from their past. So yes, and another way that we've looked at this hierarchical organization in the brain is to look at the principal gradient itself, and there we see it flattened under psychedelics, a range of different psychedelics. We've seen this effect, and it correlates with the intensity of the subjective experience, including specifically ego dissolution. So I think the model is holding up, and now, of course, the interesting quest is to see where it fails and where it needs to be improved. But I think it's useful. And I think it can help us understand how psychedelics can have therapeutic potential. And I'm just going to close it here in the interest of time and beginning late. I'm sorry for that. This is to inform you of a recent trial of ours, now accepted in New England Journal of Medicine. I've been working on the proofs today. They're due back by Monday. Publication date, we're not sure, but mid-April seems a strong candidate. And it's a 2-arm, double-blind, randomized control trial in 59 patients. The psilocybin arm, as we call it for simplicity, comprised of 2 25 milligram treatment sessions with psilocybin therapy, alongside 6 weeks of daily placebo ingestion, so inert placebo. Then in the blue corner, the escitalopram condition, patients would have 1 milligram dosing sessions with psilocybin, so 1 milligram versus 25. 1 milligram is presumed inactive, and some evidence to support that from looking at EEG with 1 milligram and not seeing any discernible effect. And so it's the escitalopram condition. So instead of 6 weeks of placebo, patients in that arm take escitalopram every day, up to 20 milligrams for the final 3 weeks. They take escitalopram for 6 weeks. So the main findings are that if we look at response rates, they were 70% at the primary endpoint, the end of that 6-week trial period, 3 weeks after the second dosing session of psilocybin, and the last day of the 6-week escitalopram course. 70% remission rates for the red corner, and in the blue corner, 50% response rates with escitalopram. Remission rates, 60% with psilocybin and 30% with escitalopram, so twice as high with psilocybin. was a funny old way the cookie crumbled. We had multiple secondary outcomes, which if assessed individually, I think virtually across the board, we had like 16, 17 secondary outcomes. I think maybe all but one would have survived significance. But because there were so many, the journal marshaled us very strictly, as is their policy, and we didn't correct for multiple comparisons, so they've asked that we not report p-values there. And then the primary outcome, which was mean change in the quids, missed. It was p equals 0.17. So the journal, again, being very strict, report the trial as negative. And all I would say is, you know, a bit of common sense here, I think. Side effect rates were similar in both conditions, different in nature, but similar in just number of spontaneous reports of adverse events. And I think I'll close it there and thank the broader team at Imperial and those who made the centre that we have at Imperial possible, the philanthropy that has really been essential to the work that we've been able to do, the freedom that we've enjoyed. And yeah, thank you all for listening and for having me. Happy to take any questions if you have any. I hope you're there.
All right, super. Thanks a lot for the wonderful talk and the encouraging result on depression. We are open for questions. I have one, maybe two, and as an icebreaker. First of all, did you do any imaging on the trial, on the New England clinical trial?
Yes.
On the subjects?
Yeah, in fact.
Structural and functional, or just structural MRI?
We did both. Now, I don't think we had DTI in the depression trial, but we acquired high-resolution anatomical data. And the functional, we've got some nice results there. We've looked at modularity in the brain. Generally in depression, previous work has suggested elevated modularity where regions and networks are more segregated from each other in depression, and that correlating with symptom severity. You could think of an energy landscape with deep depressions in it, you know, as a kind of metaphor for depression, like literal depressions of state that you fall into and it's difficult to get out. And there the prediction was that we would see a flattening of that state space post-treatment with psilocybin, and we saw that very clearly. Actually, we replicated a bit of audio issues, but we replicated that when we looked at previous data of ours, fMRI data, in a previous trial of ours. And it's correlated with improvements in symptom severity with psilocybin. And the other thing to say is we didn't actually see it in the escitalopram arm, that decrease in modularity or that opening of the energy landscape. So that's quite an exciting result. We're writing that up submission at the moment.
Did you also check for BDNF, peripheral BDNF levels, as given the pivotal role of BDNF in depression?
Do you know, that was one thing that we missed. We looked at other things, but we missed that one. Yeah, it's certainly being looked at. I know it's a bit controversial whether in the periphery it's a reliable, index of what's going on centrally, but still, something to look at. One
issue I have, and then I'll leave the floor to the discussion, is maybe there is something missing in the picture, because you are very convincing when you're talking about the intracortical association and modulations, but maybe there is something that is going on also subcortically in the thalamus, and perhaps even in the cerebellum, that has a major cognitive role, as we discover.
Yeah, some evidence for limbic involvement. So yes, I guess my account of things has been quite cortex centric, but we've got findings, and others have reported changes in limbic activity, where generally the rule is you dysregulate cortex and disinhibit release limbic, and that makes a lot of intuitive sense that be the rule. So whether it's thalamus or mediotemporal, the principle of a release limbic makes a lot of sense. It also makes sense if you think of the phenomenology of the experience as well.
All right, Marco, you want to ask something?
Oh no, no. I was thinking about the. I am just too involved thinking right now. But I was wondering why a psychedelic shouldn't it disengage from the limbic circuit if it is supposed to work on depression?
Yeah, it's more like an emotional release. So we have a paper, David Nutt and I, on differential. It's a kind of model of the different pharmacology with psychedelics versus conventional antidepressants, where the conventional, at least serotonergic antidepressants, are going to be generally increasing over time. Serotonergic tone, more serotonin in the synapse, and there's variety of different evidences that postsynaptic 1A receptors that are inhibitory are heavily expressed in limbic regions, in stress circuitry, you might say, and so that increase in serotonergic tone is going to kind of mute kind of muffle the stress circuitry, and that might map onto the sort of emotional dampening that you see with conventional antidepressants. Whereas with psychedelics, the experience is much more of a roller coaster. I mean, it would be wrong to describe the experience itself, the acute time-limited 4 or 5 hours of a magic mushroom trip, as being in and of itself antidepressant. It's not. It can be quite hellish for some patients. So it's an emotional roller coaster. It's a release. It's often ecstatic, but it can also be very challenging, and difficult memories coming up and trauma and such like. So quite different. A little, you could say sort of the inverse profile on emotion with the 2A agonist psychedelics versus what you see with conventional antidepressants. One dampening emotion and emotional responsiveness, the conventional antidepressants, and then psychedelics more like releasing emotion, and that being cathartic and part of a sort of self-development, self-growth, self-learning process that happens after the treatment session itself.
So we have a few questions. Marco Perulli, I guess, wants to ask something. Okay.
Hello. Yes, thanks for the presentation. My question was, do you think that psychedelics are useful per se in the treatment of depression and other psychiatric disorders, or you think they need to be co-administered with psychotherapy? Because you said it helps to like decrease the top-bottom control, but do you think you need to rebuild in some other shape the control, or you can just remove it?
Yes, well, it springs back. What you see acutely isn't something that hangs around, or at least it doesn't seem to. Generally speaking, I do think it is a treatment model that depends very much on the therapeutic context and container. And it may well be that good work can be done in the future to introduce structured, well manualized psychotherapy after a psychedelic experience. Whether that's CBT or some mindfulness-based therapy. And to engage that therapeutic process after the psychedelic experience, not during, but after, would be an interesting model going forwards. But to be a bit briefer in answering, I do think it requires the therapeutic container.
Well, as you remember, in the 60s, that was very in fashion to do psychoanalytic, sessions with LSD. Most of the actors we know did it. Cary Grant and others were on drugs and doing psychoanalysis. Joy, need to unmute.
Yes, good evening, sir. Good evening, Professor. Here I am. Do you hear me?
Right.
Yeah, I'm a researcher specialized in EMDR therapy. That is eye movement and desensibilization processing. And I'm trying to use music as factor to help people to re-access to old memories that cause healing and sufferings. So I'm asking you if it's possible to mix music and this kind of chemical therapy in this particular way of treating especially PTSD syndrome, I mean post-traumatic stress disorders. I know perfectly it's quite distant from your presentation, but I'm quite curious to how to use music to help people, especially in this direction. That means using a way to go far from sufferings in both directions, music, psychotherapy, and maybe using other kind of substances that could excite the limbic system and help people to get better. I mean, I don't know if I'm being cleared.
Yes, yeah. So absolutely. So yeah, music is used in all of the psychedelic therapy sessions, and there it's being used, and we have some brain evidence of this, that the music seems to provide some structure, but not too much. So some unpredictability, but also some anchorage. And I say we've got some brain evidence sort of supporting that, because without music, a certain signature of the action of psychedelics, you might call it brain entropy or complexity, is maximal when there's the least amount of sensory stimulation of any sort. So eyes closed, no music, complexity is highest. So that drops a little bit with a bit of music, and if you open your eyes, it has a even bigger effect. With speaking more to the psychology and the phenomenology, the music, yes, it has this dual function of providing some regularity in a context of intense uncertainty, often relative to the usual kind of confidence and assuredness that we have in normal waking consciousness. And then the ability to coax or kind of tease out emotion and memory. And why music can do that, I think, remains a bit of a scientific mystery. We can come up with ideas about resonance and harmonies and rhythms kind of coaxing into, external sensory rhythms coaxing internal rhythms, but we don't know. Those are just hypotheses at this stage.
This is what I'm trying to research. I'm working about modularity in brain system activated by music in this sense. This is my research, so I'm trying to get some different point of views about this question, about this point of view. I mean, so thank you about your opinion, and thank you for your lessons. They've been really interesting, and thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Another question from Milos Borozan.
Yeah, it's Borozan. Thank you first of all, and thank for the great lesson from the professor. And I just wanted to know. So years ago, I was part of a research group that tries to sort of explore possible ways from to sort of make bridges between psychoanalysis and the neuro sciences. And we specifically were trying to. There were some indications that like the default mode network could be the target structure of the free association that is the main part of psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And I remember that we found one of your old papers that was called Mourning and Melancholia Revisited.
Yeah.
Where you made a lot of really interesting connections between the two research traditions, so to say. And afterwards, I've been doing completely different things, but I wanted to know if you've continued down that road, and if you have any new findings.
Well, in a sense, I haven't directly. I was relatively fresh out of doing a master's in psychoanalysis and reading a lot of Freud, and so there was a lot of inspiration going on when I was then immersing myself in cognitive neuroscience and seeing overlaps and thinking, oh, this is fascinating, and then hearing of this of the properties of the default mode network and seeing overlaps with certain notions in psychoanalysis, and it remains a sort of area of sort of playful interest, but it's kind of because of the sort of abstract nature of psychoanalytic the psychoanalytic space, I suppose. It's hard to make any sort of concrete, compelling mappings there because of the lack of kind of concrete definitions, I suppose. So it becomes more of a sort of playful, almost sort of poetic way of doing things. I mean, I enjoy it. It's just it doesn't play such a major role in my work these days. But things. I guess what's happening is we're using measures like emotional breakthrough. We created this, quantitative measure of the intensity of emotional catharsis during a psychedelic experience, and you can easily find, strong sort of conceptual mappings and phenomenological similarities between what we're trying to tap into there and things that are talked about in psychodynamic and psychoanalytic psychology.
All right,
thank
Giovanni.
you.
Hi, Robin. A pleasure meeting you again, although we are not in London. But okay, my question is about the role of ketamine, esketamine, arketamine. Do you think these drugs, these substances, can be considered as psychedelics? And do you think that there's room for psychedelic therapy with these substances?
Yes, it's not particularly my area of expertise, ketamine, and so different pharmacology and somewhat different subjective effects, less obviously emotionally intense and compounds that cause this emotional release and very strange and dreamlike in a certain way and dissociative, and so certainly profound altered states of consciousness that aren't just a kind of blunt knocking out of consciousness, at least at the sub anesthetic doses. And there are overlaps with cortical plasticity that are quite interesting, and pro-glutamatergic effects with both compounds, albeit through different initial receptors. And then the therapeutic question, I'm certainly warm to the idea that one could bring in more psychotherapy and contextual manipulation into the ketamine experience to try and make more of the plasticity that you have there, and to shepherd people in a therapeutic direction. And I think that's being done with oral ketamine, and it's an interesting approach, and I can see why it could be additive to just getting wired up and infused with some ketamine or the nasal spray.
Okay, I guess we don't have any further question. Actually, I have one, the final one. It's, there is a lot of talk in pop culture about microdosing. I saw your eLife paper. I don't know if you want to make a comment on the placebo effect.
Well, it's massive, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So for those who haven't read that paper, it used a novel self-blinding approach where you actually instruct people how to be scientists themselves and blind themselves to what they're taking, and they don't know until the end of the course, when they do some QR code scanning, whether they were taking placebo or microdosing. When they find out, they're often really surprised. They're convinced that they were taking LSD microdoses and they were taking nothing other than empty capsules. And we found that the majority of the effects, so we did see improvements in mental health outcomes, well-being and depression scores dropping and anxiety dropping. But the majority driver of that was belief. It was the guess that you were on a microdose. So if you got placebo but thought you were getting a microdose, you did as well as if you got a microdose and thought you were getting a microdose. So and that rule that we found in microdosing in quite a big sample, it was like over 190 people, we imagine is going to be true of macrodosing as well. Belief is a major therapeutic vehicle. And I think the paradigm shift, or challenge at least for the future, is it a problem? Is it a confounder? Or is it something to exploit and harness? And I don't think that psychedelic therapy is only positive expectation, but I do believe it's a large part of it, to be honest. Yeah.
Sure, but it's also the activation of the endorphin system. So there is something rational about the placebo effect. It's not just suggestion.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if your mind is changing, your brain is changing. So sure, you engage endogenous mechanisms that have some overlap with what an active drug would be doing.
All right. Well, thank you again. I hope to see you soon, actually, in around the year, to start some fruitful collaboration. And thank you for your time, and talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Chiudo? Robin, we have an extra question if you have time. È andato, si è frozen in time.
Mi sa che è andato, prof.